Hey there, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I have a very special episode for you. I'm going to be sitting down with Michael. They work with me in my program, and they are a wonderful astrologer in their own right. So, welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining us today.
I am so happy to be in conversation with you today and to be talking about something that's really integral to the work that both of us do,
I
frankly.
know we were chatting before about what topic we might discuss, and timing is something that we both teach a lot around, but of course, we're using timing with our clients all the time. So, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the timing techniques that we both work with in our practice, but also we're going to start by just talking very briefly about the difference between, timing that you might be hearing about in a general sense versus timing that may be most relevant to you because it originates from your own birth chart. So, Michael, do you want to tell us a little bit about your take on timing, I guess?
Sure. It's something I think about a lot whenever I'm on the internet, when I'm on social media, that most of the astrology that you might read about or hear about on the internet is based on what are called transits, which is the movement of the planets through the sky in real time, like almost like changing celestial weather patterns that we all experience collectively. But that's not the only way that astrology is capable of describing time. That actually, astrology is an ancient tradition full of different ways of describing and qualifying and communicating and even shaping our ideas about how we understand or think about the times of our lives and how they unfold. And a lot of what we work with as astrologers when we're working with clients, we're thinking about how the activations of a natal chart are different from just the general transits of the planets through the signs that we experience collectively, and the ways that activations of your natal chart, your birth chart, will always be more personal and
Mm.
more specific in terms of describing your experiences, events in your lives, and the quality of time that you are moving through in your life at any given period. And these activations and developments can be described using many different techniques, not only transits. And actually, you and I both work with a number of different techniques in order to describe what we might think of as more personal astrological timing in our lives and our clients' lives and so on.
Yeah, this is a really good point. And I notice this a lot with students these days because there is so much information about astrology that's available now. When I was coming up in astrology, probably over 30 years ago, we had books. We had books and maybe the odd website. And nowadays, of course, there's websites, there's video format online like YouTube, there's, short memes, there's blogs, there's classes, there's so much that you can get access to. And you'll hear a lot of things being talked about. I'm thinking, for instance, about a very high profile transit that's happening or just started, of Jupiter coming into Cancer, which is technically a really good thing. This is a planet, a benefic planet in its exalted place, but it won't necessarily have a big impact on all of us, And
Mhm.
what you're getting at, I think, is this piece around there's the timing in astrology that kind of describes the weather. Is it sunny outside? Is there a thunderstorm coming in? And then there's the timing in astrology that is really unique to you, which originates out of your own personal birth chart. And that can describe, well, it might be sunny outside, but inside of your chart, there could be a little bit of a hailstorm coming through. Or maybe it is a hailing outside, but in your little corner of the world, in your chart, there's this beautiful rainbow that's just
Mhm.
appeared. And so I think this is a really important distinction for anyone who's exploring astrology to understand that, the way I kind of think it is like the two levels of, this is the collective shift, like Uranus coming into Gemini or Saturn changing signs, but it's what is that doing for me, if anything, coming
Right.
from the understanding of that's one of the timing techniques, transits that an astrologer might use to let you know about your own personal experiences. Yeah. And so you mentioned transits, Michael, and I know this is a technique that most people are familiar with because of this sort of real time kind of framing that they have, like this thing is in this place or this sign, and that must mean something. And it probably means something, but it may not be the most important thing. I think
Mhm.
about, and this is like my old school, and I think about a newspaper and like what was above the fold versus what might have been on page five. And what was on page five is still something of note, but what was on the front page above the fold is, a really highlighted thing. And that might come from techniques most of the time for a really astute practicing professional consulting astrologer. Those major timing techniques are not coming from transits, they're coming from other events. So, what are some of your favorite timing techniques that aren't transits that you use all the time with clients?
There are so many, and that's maybe something that we can say from the start is there
Yeah.
are so many different timing techniques that have been introduced over the last 2000 years or more of this ancient tradition that we work with. And so every astrologer works with the ones that are meaningful to them or make the most sense to them or complement one another in ways that are useful or generative for their own lives or the work that they're doing with clients. And the way that I think about it is that each of these different timing techniques tell different parts of the life story or different stories that are unfolding simultaneously in different
Mm,
areas of the life. And each one of these techniques are calculated differently. They have their own kind of internal logic and consistency or their kind of quality or feeling, how we
mm,
work with them. Largely, we could say that they are divided into kind of two categories, what we might think of as real-time timing techniques like transits, which have to do with where the planets are moving in real time through the sky. And then a really large category of timing techniques that we can think of as symbolic timing techniques.
mm,
And these are techniques that are not immediately tied to the unfolding of the planets in the sky right now, but have other logics or other methods of moving different influences
mm,
or activations through a person's chart. And the way that I tend to work is I like starting with what I think of as the larger context
mm.
or bigger picture pieces of astrology. These are stories that can unfold well over a year, sometimes over several years, sometimes, depending on the technique, even over several decades.
Decades. Yeah.
And I like starting with that big picture because it just gives us a sense of some of the major themes or story arcs that are unfolding in a person's life at that scale. And then we can move to techniques or stories that are unfolding at shorter time frames or shorter scales, things that are maybe happening over just a few years or a year or even shorter than a year. And working in that way gives us a sense of maybe what's part of the larger context within which some of these smaller or shorter stories are unfolding.
Mm,
And the way that I tend to mix and match techniques, and maybe some that we can talk about today, and for some of those larger context, bigger picture pieces of the astrology, I often work with an ancient symbolic timing technique called zodiacal releasing, as well as another ancient symbolic timing technique called secondary progressions. And then within that, I often work with transits, but transits that are specific to a person's chart, as well as another ancient symbolic timing technique called annual profections. And I know those are all techniques that you work with as well. And actually, I've studied some of those techniques with you.
yes,
Um,
yeah, and now you help me teach them to others,
and
which
now we
is
teach them together
which
to
is
other people.
wonderful. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're definitely techniques. I mean, zodiacal releasing, secondary progressions, annual perfections, they're all techniques that have their own kind of, I don't know if it's their own internal logic or mechanics where there is movement that originates in the birth chart based on a particular rationale or methodology. And I think the simplest one to kind of just give a very brief overview would be annual perfections, which is very simply linking your age to one or another of the 12 houses. And of course, we all live, hopefully, many of us will live to be older than 12 many times over, but it's a sort of a repeating pattern such that ages like 30 and 42 and 54 are all tied to, say, the seventh house in the chart. And so that, the mechanics in the annual profections is age, house, repeat every 12 years kind of thing. Whereas the diacal releasing has a much longer timeline, and that's the technique where we can get these 30-year chapters
Mhm.
or chunks of time that come forward. And so it is really useful as a consulting astrologer to have a mix of techniques that we can speak to around this 12-year chunk of time or this 20-year chunk of time versus what's happening in the next 12 months, if you
Mhm.
like. And so I think to the point you were making earlier around different practicing astrologers will collect their own sort of toolkit of a variety of different timing techniques that resonate with them, that they feel they can use in a helpful way or an accessible way with their clients. Because, throughout history, there has been different timing mechanisms, and different astrologers have emphasized, if not different techniques, certainly different places of deriving meaning from
Mhm.
within different techniques. And that, of course, still happens today with astrologers sort of saying, well, I like this technique, and somebody's like, I like that technique, and that's totally okay. One of the things we say a lot to students is it's not so much that there's right techniques and wrong techniques,
Mhm.
it's can you use a technique effectively? Like, do you understand it? Do you know what it's trying to give you information about? Do you know the mechanics of how it works? And the most important thing I find as an astrologer who works with clients who aren't necessarily well versed in astrology is, can you get some useful information out of that timing technique that you can then clearly explain to your client in such a way that it's accessible, that
Mhm.
they understand it, and that they can make meaning with those cycles in their own life. So I know this timing topic is so big and so rich, really, isn't it?
Totally. And I loved the language that you used in terms of with these different techniques, especially the symbolic timing techniques, there being some kind of mechanic that creates motion through the
Mm,
chart.
mm,
And in different ways, the motion, whatever the mechanics or the internal logic is, that motion tells us that some parts of the chart are maybe more active or pronounced at some parts of life and
mm,
maybe more in the background at other parts of life. Like if we think of the technique that you were describing in terms of annual profections, and moving through the chart for each year of life. Well, as a different part of the chart is activated, that's going to tell us some house topics that maybe are going to be more prominent or emphasized during that year of life.
yes.
There's going to be a planet that is said to be the ruler of the sign that occupies that house. And that planet is in some way said to be responsible for that year, describing the quality of that year, maybe describing some of the experiences that are more central or more prominent during that year of life. And while we can make some maybe like general statements that, everyone who's 40 is going to be in a fifth house perfection year, or everyone who's 50 is going to be in a third house perfection year, it's actually the unique configuration
Mm,
of each person's chart that's going to make those experiences really different and unique and personal. Not everyone's third house perfection year at 50 is going to be the same. It's going to depend on what sign is on that house. Are there any planets in that house? What planets are they? What planet rules that house and where is it located in the chart? And that's where we start to get these very unique and personal configurations of how a chart comes
mm,
alive at different periods of time and at different points in our lives. And annual perfections does that on the year to year basis. And then a technique like zodiacal releasing, as we were talking about, zodiacal releasing is another ancient symbolic timing technique that divides the life into different periods or chapters for which different planets are said to be responsible. And at the longest periods that zodiacal releasing describes, those periods can be anywhere from 8 to 30 years long. And that can give us some really important insight in terms of like, okay, for this chapter of my life, what are the themes or the qualities or the experiences that might take most of my attention or where I can direct some of my attention and energy and activity? What's the planet that's responsible for that period? And how might we think of that planet almost as a guide or as a teacher for those years, whether it's eight
mm,
years or 25 years or 30 years, that being like a period of time where we're doing maybe more focused or intensive learning
mm.
or experiencing or work around the themes and topics associated with that planet. And then in zodiacal releasing, we have these long periods, and then each of those long periods are subdivided into shorter periods, periods that can be a matter of months or a matter of weeks or even a matter of days. And that's where we start to get a lot of nuance and
Mm,
complexity and the layering of different themes and topics and qualities and experiences that we get from each of these playing out, each of these layers, each of these levels playing out in relation to one another. And again, all of that is entirely unique to each person's chart.
mm,
When those periods start and end is going to be specific to where we're starting from in a person's chart. And so that's like just another example of how working with some of these techniques really gives us some
mm.
valuable insight or perspective on what is unfolding for this unique person during this specific period of their life.
Mm. Yeah, I think this is so helpful because it's helpful for people to understand that, first of all, like the top line pieces, your experiences are uniquely described by a combination of things that is in your personal birth chart.
Right.
And with a lot of these symbolic techniques, we're starting from a certain place. It could be your age for annual profections, it could be the lot of fortune for zodiacal releasing, and the unfolding or the timing that kind of spins out from there is unique based on your chart.
Mhm.
Something you said earlier, which I know we say a lot with students, which is that, your experience of this is based on what's in your birth chart as a starting place. And that what's in your birth chart is not all active and prominent all the time.
Right.
That via these different timing techniques, they clue us into, oh, right now, your Sagittarius 11th house, that is emphasized, that is in the
Mhm.
spotlight, for instance. And that could be for a 12-month period via annual profections. It could be for a 12-year period via zodiacal releasing. But via one or another of these mechanisms, that part of your chart comes into a more influential kind of state, if you like. And I think that's, when people come into astrology and they're like, I've got this chart, it's got all these things in it, and everybody has a birth chart that is a mix of more effective and useful placements and planets, and some planets and placements that are a little sometimes ineffective or a little scattered or a little delayed, even. And so, understanding what's in the birth chart as a starting place is definitely essential. And then we get to know the more effective or ineffective parts of our chart as they kind of come up via these different timing pieces. And I think that's a really useful way for people to think about, well, this thing is in my chart, but it's not super front and center right
Mhm.
now. And so there's maybe other pieces. And I think, we've talked a lot about annual profections and zodiacal releasing, which are similar conceptually, even though the
Mhm.
mechanics are quite different. And then the other technique that we mentioned, which I know we both use, secondary progressions, this has kind of a different conceptual framework and even a different mechanics kind of inside it. That's using, I guess, that day for a year system where, transits, real time planetary movements that might be happening on like the 15th day of your life become meaningful in a symbolic kind of totally random way for when you're 15 years old. And so I know that concept that underpins secondary progressions sounds very wild, but it is so insightful in
Mhm.
practice. So yeah, that's a technique that you use as well, right?
Absolutely. It's one of my core techniques, and especially in terms of establishing some of the larger, longer themes in
Mm,
certain parts of the technique. And yeah, I think for people who've maybe never heard of something like that before, or thinking about time in that way of taking a day of life to be descriptive of a year of life, that might feel new and unfamiliar. And I also find it extremely elegant and almost poetic. This idea
mm,
that within the first number of days of life, there are things that unfold at a scale that we might think of it as almost like the microcosm,
mm.
or almost like foreshadowing at the scale of the microcosm, that then unfolds almost like a fractal
Yes.
across the years of our lives at the scale of the
Mm.
macrocosm. And within secondary progressions, depending on the speeds of the planets that we're looking at, or the kind of the way, the phases of the planets that we're working with, sometimes it can describe things that unfold over a couple of months. Sometimes it can describe experiences or events that are unfolding over a couple of years. Sometimes it can describe experiences that maybe take 3 to 4 years of our life. And that kind of layering and leveling of different periods of time, but also
Mm,
different qualities of experience. That was something that you were pointing to in terms of each of our natal charts has a whole rich, complex tapestry of different experiences that we are likely to encounter throughout our lives. And some of those come forward more prominently at some times and less prominently at other times. And using even one technique like this, like secondary progression, could describe certain qualities of experience. Maybe things are feeling really abundant, or there's a lot of growth in one area of life. And at the
mm,
same time, we can see another progression that's like, oh, it looks like there's maybe a little bit more struggle or a little bit more restriction in
mm,
this area of life. And I think that can be another really useful way of thinking about timing in astrology is it's not just one thing
mm,
unfolding during a period of time. Whether we're working with one technique or layering multiple techniques like we're describing, part of the beauty or the magic of that is it gives us a way of thinking about what the quality of different parts of our lives might
mm,
be that are unfolding concurrently at the same time, such that like maybe things are really advancing in terms of your career and your professional roles, and you're getting a lot of opportunity. And maybe you're having some conflict or some struggle with your family or your siblings at the same time. And things like that, that level of nuance and detail are things we can only get to whenever we're working with techniques that are personal to someone's natal chart. This language that we're using of personal astrological timing, which is distinct from the general celestial weather patterns that we might be experiencing through the real time transits of the planets. That said, you and I do both use transits in
mm,
personal astrological timing, but we use it in a way that's a little bit different than how things might be talked about on blogs or on YouTube or on social media, et cetera, which are talking about where the planets are moving through the signs, which can be important contextual information. Like you said, Jupiter moving into Cancer, that's a really beneficial, a really positive experience or potentially positive context for experience. But what might that mean for someone's unique chart or for someone's specific life? And that's where we start looking at what are the relationships between the transits of the planets in the sky right now with where the planets were in someone's birth chart.
mm,
In astrological terms, we're looking for exact aspects or geometric patterns that we work with as astrologers. And when the planets in the real time sky are making some sort of direct connection or contact with the natal chart, then
mm,
that collective experience of the planets moving through particular places in the sky, we bring that down to the personal level. It's so,
mm.
in a way, personalizing what might otherwise be a collective experience and asking, well, where is that going to show up? Or where might that show up in this specific person's life? How might the quality that we might associate with something like Uranus in Gemini or Saturn in Aries or Jupiter in Cancer,
Mm.
what areas of life are likely to be described or impacted by those transits? And that's going to depend on making those exact aspects, those direct contacts between where the planets are in the sky right now and where they were in someone's birth chart.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful distinction or clarification for people too, is that I know there's a lot of excitement in, the astrology space online about Uranus coming into Gemini or Saturn into Aries. And these are important to note you used this beautiful phrase earlier today of describing the general quality of time in
Mm.
which we're all living and operating. And then to make that more personal, if you are a person who has a planet in your personal chart at 0 or 1 or 2 degrees of Gemini, or maybe of one of the other mutable signs, so 0 or 1 or 2 degrees of Gemini or Virgo or Sagittarius or Pisces, then that immediate entry of Uranus into Gemini is directly aspecting that thing in your personal chart. If you and that becomes very important for you as an individual. If you have planets that might be in those mutable signs but are at like 10 or 12 or 14 degrees of those mutable signs, you're probably not dealing with the strongest experience of that Uranus in Gemini transit for a few years, until transiting Uranus actually comes to that degree in Gemini that will make that exact aspect to your birth chart. And this is really important because with the sort of explosion of information about astrology, I think people are still learning to kind of grasp that distinction
Mhm.
of, is this something that's happening to make note of? Fair enough. Is this something that is of significance or special importance for me individually? And there can be a difference there. And what you're saying, Michael, to clue people in, is that watch for those exact degree-based activations via transit.
Mhm.
And I know with some of the ways that we work with transits, we would look to, Uranus making an exact degree based aspect to something in your birth chart. If your midheaven is at 0 Gemini, yes, this is going to be big for you, whoever that might be. Uh, but we would also think about maybe qualifying or assessing the transits based on things like the annual profections,
Mhm.
where we might consider, oh, if you're in a period of time where that guiding planet, according to your annual profections, is Saturn, then, transits involving Saturn, you can be more sensitive to for that time period. And
Mhm.
so, as you're starting to sort of bring in, yes, we do work with transits, but in some very specific ways. The ways in which we do work with transits is when we can really anchor them to a personal piece in your birth chart, whether it's a connection to another timing mechanism that we've already used, or whether it's directly aspecting or activating, we might say, something in your birth chart. And these are the pieces that working astrologers look to for describing these kind of hotspot periods of time in your life where there's more activity or more significant events and experiences that are coming through. So I love that you're bringing in about transits and how we
Mhm.
might get to them as being significant for a person.
And I love that you are pointing to something that we do as consulting astrologers all the time, which is looking for some sort of repetition across
Mm,
multiple techniques. So, yes, maybe there is a Uranus transit to your natal Saturn. And if Saturn happens to be the planet that's responsible for describing some period of time in your life, whether it's the year by annual perfection or a longer period by zodiacal releasing, or if you can see that there's also a progression involving Saturn at the same time, then when we start to see more than one technique that has
mm,
totally different mathematical rationale and methods of calculation, there's no reason those things would ever coincide in that way. But when we start to see that coincidence or that repetition, that gives us so much insight into where we might put our attention or our focus or our energy or even just our awareness of things that might be unfolding in our own lives and our clients' lives. And that's part of the beauty of working with multiple timing techniques is it gives us that opportunity to see where is more than one technique pointing maybe toward the same direction or toward the
mm,
same qualities of experience or the same kinds of events that we might expect during that period. That's one reason we might work with more than one timing technique. And also, if we zoom out just a little bit, one of the things that I think is so beautiful about working with multiple um, timing techniques in astrology is that when we work with a range of timing techniques,
mm,
both symbolic and real time, we are cultivating an experience of multiple temporalities or ways of experiencing
mm,
time that are moving or unfolding simultaneously in concert with one another and each with different qualities and all unfolding at different scales. And I think that does so much um, just in terms of shaping or supporting another way of moving through our lives, of moving through the
Mm,
world, maybe in ways that are less tied to what we might think of as like some of our normative conditioning around time. Things
yes.
like, I don't know, the 40-hour work week or the 24-hour news cycle or quarterly reports or quarterly projections or even something like the normative expectations for how a life will unfold. Like you're going to go to
Mm,
primary school and then you're going to go to secondary school. Maybe you'll go to college. You're going to get a job. Maybe you'll get married. You'll have a house. You'll have some kids. And this idea that life is supposed to unfold in this
mm.
very predictable, expected, linear trajectory. When we go into astrology, not only do we get not a linear projection of time, we get a very cyclical understanding of
Yes.
time in all of these
Yes.
techniques, but we also
Yes.
start to get this perspective of each life as having its own process of unfolding that's entirely specific and unique to that life in any one of these techniques, but even more so in the ways that they come together to describe the life. And I think that that is one of the greatest gifts that astrology has given me and so many of the people that I work with as clients is just another way of operating in our lives in ways of understanding or moving through time that are less um, conditioned by our social expectations, our cultural conventions, and more tied to what are the specific needs and um, desires and directions that this
Mm,
life might be moving
mm.
in. Does that make some sense?
This is so beautiful, Michael. I'm like just loving everything you're saying because you're really putting into words so much of what I have experienced and believed in my own practice, like with astrology personally, in the lives of my loved ones, and of course with clients. A lot of the work in a session and a lot of the material, it's not work, it's not effortful because astrology sessions are just such a place of joy for me, but a lot of the discussion it can be centered around, you know, the indications for the quality of time for you personally at this given point in your life might be XYZ. You know, we worked with the progressed moon phases a lot, which gives this
Hmm.
beautiful 30-year timing template. And the simplest way to speak to that in a non-technical way is, you know, the early spring through the blush of summer, through the fall, the autumn, and into the winter retreat or
Hmm.
rest. And, you know, to be able to say to people, oh, right now you're in like peak summer. So this is a period in your life which is busy and highly active and energetic, and there may be more drive or motivation or enthusiasm, you know, and that can be a clue that there is this underlying of like, yes, go for it right now.
Hmm.
And then we might have other periods in our lives, which could be the balsamic or dark moon phase, or maybe something to do with the 12th house or even Saturn. I'm in a very Saturnian place myself with one of my timing techniques. And it was very explicit for me to be, you know, that hermit, that idea of the
Hmm.
pullback, you know, the quieter times, the cycles that indicate periods of quiet rest, maybe withdrawal or lower activity. And this is the thing that I get a real buzz about working with clients because, for the same reasons you say, working with timing in astrology connects us to an understanding of our life as a whole that is different from, you know, cultural conventions or social conventions. And it's also, to me, this connects me straight back to kind of divine and natural
Hmm.
timing, which is cyclical and which has periods of activity followed by periods of celebration and then periods of rest. And we don't always see that modeled in social
Right.
and cultural, you know, frameworks of time or life unfolding. And to me, it feels like a reanimation or a re
Hmm.
enlivening of understanding that life is not meant to just be, you know, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday from start to finish. It will have peaks and troughs and ebbs and flows. And when you look at the lives of artists and musicians and creatives, you look at the arc of a life over 80 or 90 years, you see that while they may have left a legacy, they were not at their peak productivity output for the entire 60 years of their active working adult life. They had these bursts, and
Mhm.
sometimes the burst is 5 to 8 years, sometimes it's 14 years, sometimes it's a bit longer, sometimes it's shorter still. If you think about Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird,
Mhm.
this sort of very intensive outburst and output of one thing that became this sort of piece that was quite seminal for a long period. And so this is what I really enjoy working with clients, is to help them understand when is it an appropriate time to maybe push that little bit more or go a little bit harder, and when might it be more appropriate that there is a slowing or a releasing or a
Mhm.
stilling or a reorienting. And this is where I think astrology helps people understand themselves,
Yeah.
because a person who's sort of aware and living and paying attention to their own inner experience will sometimes attune to some internal conflict between what they're feeling
Mhm.
inside versus the expectation or messaging they're getting externally. And to be able to, whether it's validate or amplify or give some context to the timing and the framing of the energy of the period they're in, it's very calming and healing for people to
Mhm.
understand, that there are these different qualities of energy that come through. And you've sent me on this whole soapbox tangent here, Michael, because I feel this so much. And, I know that you would see this too in session with clients.
All the time. I mean, the
Yeah.
two pieces that it's making me think of, one is just um, underlying or amplifying a piece that you had already pointed to, which is um, re-attenuating us to the cyclical nature of
Mhm.
um, growth and productivity, and then rest and recovery and letting go that we see in so many different cycles, especially in the progress lunation cycle. And many of us are living in cultures where there's a relentless demand for endless productivity,
Yeah.
to always be accelerating, to always be doing more, to always be building. And when we get back into the cycle of the planets, the cycle of the
Mm,
seasons, the cycles of the moon, we remember that actually everything around us waxes and wanes, builds and diminishes,
mm,
that moves in cycles where there is periods of heat and growth and fruition. And then there's periods of letting go and composting and resting and
mm.
just getting back into touch with those kinds of rhythms and cycles, I think can be profoundly healing, not only for individuals, but also for culture. The
Mm.
more of us who can actually live our lives in alignment with those kinds of cycles, I
Yeah.
think what a different world we are in the process of co-creating when we do this astrological work with one another. And then the other thing it made me think of is how many of these techniques point us towards specific planets being
Mm.
more significant during different periods of our lives. And
Yeah.
even that can just give us
Yes.
a sense of like, where might I put more of my attention and energy during this time? Maybe I'm in
Yes.
a period for which Venus is responsible. And maybe I have a career and there's work that I'm doing out in the world, but maybe some of the most important uh, effort or learning that I can do in this period might be around love and pleasure.
Mm.
Loving
Yeah.
others in our lives. What does it mean to love well, including loving ourselves well? What does it
Yeah.
mean to actually examine and search our own desires and get in touch with our own pleasures? Or
Mm.
maybe you're in a period for which Mars is responsible and you're doing a lot of learning around reclaiming access to healthy expressions of anger or how to navigate conflict as a necessary part of being in a world that celebrates difference. Or maybe
Mm.
you're in a period for which, I don't know, the moon is responsible and you're doing a lot of work or study or learning around your own body and getting
Mm.
in touch with your embodied felt sense of who it is that you are and how you navigate the world and what is necessary for your physical and emotional well-being. I'm not going to go through all the planets, but
No,
just
but
use those as examples of like
yes,
what
yes,
might be more important right now rather than
yes,
the sort of dominant narratives, which is like, well, you should always be growing your career or you should always be taking care of your family. And it's like, yes, those things might be part of your life, but
yes.
what if some of the most important things during this year or these 4 years or these 30 years, like what if some of the most important things that you could be giving your attention to are actually described by the archetypal significations that are attributed to these different planets. And the
Hmm.
planets giving us a kind of focal point for our energy and our attention and our effort and our lives' directions, for example.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point, Michael. And it's another example of these timing techniques cluing us into not everything at all at once.
Yes.
That maybe it's a Mercury time, maybe it's a
Right.
Mars time, and even though we have to do other things necessarily, like we may have to work for money or, contribute to the function of a home or a household or a family dynamic, we can be intentional with
Mhm.
our time outside of those necessary things that we may apply it to the exploration of anger and assertiveness if we're in a Mars period, or to more intellectual pursuits if we're in a Mercury,
Mhm.
governed period in our life. And so I think that's a really beautiful point that people can use the motifs or the characteristics or the traits of the different planets as kind of consciously intentional guides for set
Mhm.
periods of time. And I know that I think annual profections becomes a really accessible place for people to start exploring that. I know in my own experience, when you've gone from a Mars to a Venus ruled year, the Mars year, I'm like, there was more friction, and just
Mhm.
navigating differences was such a big part of that year. And then and this is obviously the Aries to Taurus shift where
Right.
we go from Mars to Venus. And then to come into, this was years ago, but I always remember the coming into the Taurus, it was like, it was ease and beauty, and there was music and more time in nature. And part of it sort of evolved without a lot of intentional effort. And then when I placed a small amount of intentional energy
Mhm.
towards it, it really amplified. And it's so lovely to think about, this is what I'm working with now. And what can I learn from this? And how can I get to know this planetary archetype, in my chart and as a guide for this
Mhm.
period?
Yeah, I
Oh,
loved what you said in terms of not all at once and also not all the same. You might
yes,
be in a Mercury period. Someone else might be in a Venus period. Someone else might be in a
exactly.
Saturn period. And that
Yeah.
gets us out of this idea. It's like that everyone's lives are supposed to look the same way or that we're all supposed to be doing the same thing. It's like, well, no, my work for this period might be different from yours. And then we get to
Yes.
like see how our lives with our loved ones, with our friends, with our community, with our families, with our coworkers, kind of complement and wrap around and weave together because we're all
Mm,
doing what is our work for this time in our lives
for
and
that
our
time.
learning.
Yes. Oh, so beautiful.
Yeah,
Michael, I know we could talk for days
of
about this,
course.
but I feel like we've shared some really good pieces about timing. Is there anything you want to share on this topic before we sort of start to make our way to a close?
No, I think we've done a pretty thorough job in terms of thinking about how this personal astrological timing is distinct from the general celestial weather patterns that we're experiencing collectively, some of the reasons why professional astrologers work with multiple timing techniques. We've talked about just a few of those timing techniques that we work with in our own
Mm,
practices, how they complement one another, how they coincide with one another, and how they can provide really valuable insights and intentions for how we're navigating our lives. And then some of this perhaps more philosophical, but also really rich
mm,
and meaningful thinking around how we experience time, especially the time of our own lives and the ways that
mm.
astrology can support us in doing that.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful summary. I don't want to, ruin it by adding more, but I do want to make sure we say a couple of things and we let people know where to find you, because I know you do offer consults. And so if people are thinking, I'd like to know more about my own timing, I couldn't recommend Michael highly enough. They are a wonderful consulting astrologer. So, Michael, let us know, what's the best place for people to find out more about you? Is it via your website?
Yes, it is via my website. My website is michaeljmorris.co. And there you can find lots of information about my practice. Specifically, my current offerings are offering one-on-one consultations, both astrology and also tarot as well. But per the conversation that we're having today, I offer natal consultations, really doing a deep dive into the natal chart itself, and then also timing-based consultations, which is more like what we've been talking about today. And then I also offer one-on-one tutoring and mentorship. And that's primarily an offering for students of astrology, people who have maybe already a beginner intermediate understanding of astrology, but maybe have specific questions or things that they have worked on their own, or maybe read books about, or maybe even taken courses on those topics. But it would feel really supportive to have a person to ask some questions and
Yes,
to talk through
yes,
things. So those are
yeah.
two of my primary offerings right now, and all of that can be found on my website. Um, yeah, and in addition to my consulting practice, you also have done so much teaching about all of these topics, about all of the techniques we've
Yes.
talked about today in terms of annual profections, zodiacal releasing, transits, progressions, and then a lot of other teaching. Do you want to tell people where they can find that
Yes.
information?
Yes. So I'll just want to make sure I say your website again. So it's
Oh,
michaeljmorris.co, where people can
correct.
find out more or get on your mailing list, to find out about bookings and things for sure. I know we're both like, oh, but make sure you talk about you. Make sure you talk about your things. Yes. So I do teach on all kinds of astrology from beginner to intermediate to advanced topics. You'll find out all the details over at my website, kellysastrology.com. The biggest piece to make sure you know about, especially if you're wanting to start a program of study in astrology that might take you from those early foundational steps through to being able to consult with clients yourself. The intake for my next full astrology training program is coming up in September. So you can find out details on the website, kellysastrology.com. Just go to the Learn Astrology tab, and there's lots of info there. So if you're wanting to learn astrology from the beginning, you can take that course. But if you just want to learn about zodiacal releasing or annual profections, there are teachings on those as well. And you will definitely see Michael in some of those teachings as well. So I think that's it. We've shared your website. We've talked about timing. We got to do a little bit of our favorite philosophizing around the role of timing in astrology and to share a little bit about some of the techniques and even to make that distinction, as you said, between, general timing and transits that's just in the collective versus getting into the personal piece. And, one thing I always say to clients is if you've sat down with someone and they've gone through your personal chart with you, they have given you the most detailed timing that is
Mhm.
available to you. So definitely follow that for any of you who've had that experience. And if you're wanting to have that experience, you'll get so much insight and guidance from a consult with Michael. So I
Mhm.
think for now, I will say thank you so much for joining me today, Michael. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and to learn with you and to teach with you, and yeah, all the ways in which we complement one another's work and yeah, ways of being in the world. So thank
It's
you.
beautiful. Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for listening and joining us for today's conversation. If you have any comments or reflections that you want to share, let us know in the
Mm.
comments section below. Otherwise, we'll say bye for now and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you.